December 18th, 1944. 6 p.m. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. SS Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Peiper stood in the cupola of his King Tiger tank, binoculars pressed against his eyes, scanning the darkening landscape ahead. His Kampfgruppe, the armoured spearhead of the 6th SS Panzer Army, had been racing west for 2 days, leaving devastation in its wake. The plan was simple: punch through the American lines, race to the Meuse River, capture the bridges and drive onto Antwerp. Cut off the Allied armies, win the war. Peiper had veterans of the Eastern Front under his command, men who had fought from the gates of Moscow to the forests of Belgium. They had crushed Soviet tank armies. They had broken through fortified lines that were supposed to be impenetrable, and now they faced the Americans, soft soldiers from across the Atlantic, who'd been in Europe for barely a year. Through his binoculars, Peiper could see the small bridge at Habiemont, a stone structure crossing a creek. It was the only bridge for miles, the only way his 100-ton tanks could continue their advance toward the Meuse. Between his position and that bridge stood what appeared to be a small American force, perhaps a squad of infantry, maybe 2. Nothing that could stop 5,000 battle-hardened SS troops and over 100 tanks and armoured vehicles. Peiper couldn't help but grin. Then the world exploded. The bridge at Habiemont disappeared in a massive blast of fire and smoke, chunks of stone and timber shooting hundreds of feet into the air. Debris rained down on his lead tanks. When the smoke cleared, where a bridge had stood moments before, there was nothing but a smoking crater and a creek that his massive tanks could not cross. Peiper slammed his fist on the turret of his tank. The words that came from his mouth, recorded by multiple witnesses and later entering military legend, were delivered with a mixture of fury and disbelief. "Dies verdammten Pioniere. Those damned engineers. Those damned engineers." What Peiper didn't know, what German High Command had catastrophically underestimated, was that those damned engineers were members of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion, and they were about to systematically destroy every German plan for the Ardennes offensive. More critically, German officers had no concept of what American combat engineers actually were. In the German military, pioneers were specialists. They built bridges, they cleared mines, they prepared fortifications. They were support troops, not combat soldiers. When fighting started, they withdrew and let the infantry handle it. The Americans had created something entirely different. The men of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion and dozens of other engineer units like them across Europe were not support troops. They were combat soldiers who happened to be excellent at building things and extraordinary at destroying them. They could construct a bridge under artillery fire in the morning and fight off a panzer assault as infantry in the afternoon. They carried rifles, machine guns and bazookas alongside their demolition charges and surveying equipment. They were trained to kill just as effectively as they were trained to calculate load-bearing capacity. And German commanders, steeped in traditional military doctrine, had no frame of reference for this hybrid warrior. To understand how this came to be, we need to go back to 1943, when Colonel David Pergrin, a 26-year-old civil engineer from Pennsylvania, took command of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion at Camp Swift, Texas. Pergrin was not a career military man. He had graduated from Penn State in 1940 with an engineering degree, played football, and had been senior class president. He was the one who presented the university with its famous Nittany Lion Shrine. He had planned on building bridges and roads in peacetime. Instead, he would build them in war. The men Pergrin commanded were equally unlikely warriors: farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, college students whose educations had been interrupted by Pearl Harbor. They arrived at Camp Swift as civilians in uniform, and over the next year they were transformed into something the world had never quite seen before. The training was brutal and comprehensive. They learned combat engineering, demolitions, mine warfare, bridge construction, road building and fortification. But unlike engineer units in other armies, they also underwent full combat infantry training. They learned to assault fortified positions, to conduct patrols, to fight house to house. They qualified on every infantry weapon from the M1 Garand rifle to the Browning .30 caliber machine gun to the 2.36-inch bazooka. They conducted forced marches carrying both combat loads and engineering equipment, often exceeding 80 pounds per man. Pergrin drove his men hard because he understood something that would prove prophetic. In modern mechanized warfare, engineers would always be at the front. They had to be. Armies moved on bridges and roads, and engineers built bridges and roads. This meant engineers would inevitably encounter enemy forces, and they needed to be able to fight. The 291st deployed to England in September 1943, then landed on Omaha Beach on June 7, 1940, one day after D-Day. Over the next 6 months, they supported the Allied advance across France and into Belgium. They built 23 timber bridges, 44 Bailey bridges, and 7 treadway bridges. They cleared 7,000 mines. They repaired hundreds of miles of roads, and crucially, they learned to work under fire. By December 1944, the 291st had established a reputation as one of the most capable engineer units in the European theatre. They could throw a Bailey bridge across a river in hours, working through the night under blackout conditions. They could clear a road of mines while under artillery bombardment. They had developed a casual competence with explosives that bordered on artistic. And then came the Ardennes. On December 16, 1944, Hitler launched his last great offensive in the West. Over 400,000 German troops, 1,400 tanks and assault guns, and thousands of artillery pieces smashed into the thinly held American lines in the Ardennes forest. The goal was to split the Allied armies, capture the supply port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace. German planning assumed their panzers would race through the Ardennes, crossing at designated bridge sites and reaching the Meuse River within 4 days. What they didn't plan for was running into Lieutenant Colonel Pergrin and the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion. The 291st had been scattered across Belgium and eastern France, working on various construction projects. When the German offensive began, Pergrin received fragmentary and confusing reports. German paratroopers behind the lines, panzer columns breaking through, American units retreating in disorder. Command and control had broken down. Communication was sporadic. The situation was chaos. Pergrin made a decision that would prove crucial. Instead of withdrawing west with other American units, he ordered his scattered companies to converge on Malmedy, Belgium, a small town that sat at a critical road junction. Control Malmedy, and you controlled the roads to the Meuse. Lose Malmedy, and German panzers would have a clear path west. On December 17th, the first elements of the 291st reached Malmedy and immediately began preparing defences. They didn't have orders to hold the town. They had no infantry support. They were, by doctrine, supposed to be building bridges, not defending road junctions. Pergrin didn't care about doctrine. He looked at the map, saw that Malmedy was the key to the entire northern shoulder of the German offensive, and decided his engineers would hold it. That afternoon, 3 American soldiers stumbled into the 291st's position at Malmedy. They were wounded, in shock, and barely able to speak. When they could finally talk, they told a story that would electrify the American army and enter history as one of the most notorious atrocities of the war. The 3 men were survivors of Battery B, 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion. They had been captured by Kampfgruppe Piper that morning at the Bernier Crossroads, just south of Malmedy. Over 130 Americans had surrendered. The Germans had herded them into a field. And then, without warning, German troops had opened fire with machine guns and pistols, systematically murdering American prisoners of war. Most of the men had been killed. A handful had escaped by playing dead or fleeing into the woods. These 3 had made it to Malmedy. Pergrin immediately reported the massacre to higher headquarters. The news spread like wildfire through American units. The Malmedy massacre, as it would be known, enraged American troops. More importantly for the immediate tactical situation, it told Pergrin exactly who he was facing. Joachim Piper, the golden boy of the Waffen-SS, Hitler's former adjutant. Ruthless, skilled commander whose Kampfgruppe was spearheading the entire German offensive. And Piper was coming straight for Malmedy. Pergrin had perhaps 128 engineers in Malmedy at that moment. Piper had over 5,000 SS troops, and more than 100 tanks. The odds were not good. What Pergrin had that Piper didn't was intimate knowledge of every bridge, every road, every choke point in the region. The 291st had spent months operating in this area. They had built roads, repaired bridges, conducted surveys. Pergrin knew the terrain better than many locals, and he knew exactly how to turn that terrain into a death trap. Over the next 3 days, small teams of engineers from the 291st conducted one of the most effective delaying actions in military history. As Piper's column raced west, they found bridge after bridge destroyed. Not damaged, destroyed. completely obliterated by expertly placed demolition charges that dropped the structures into rivers and creeks, creating obstacles that would take days to bypass. At Habillemont, a small bridge over a creek was blown literally in the face of Piper's lead tanks. At Trois Ponts, 3 bridges, 2 over the Sarme River and 1 over the Amblève River, were destroyed in succession as German spearheads approached. At Stavelot, the critical bridge over the Amblève was captured by German forces on December 17th, but American engineers managed to destroy it on December 19th, cutting off Piper's supply lines. The Germans couldn't understand how it was happening. How were the Americans demolishing bridges with such perfect timing? How were these engineers, who should have been support troops, fighting like infantry? At Stoumont, a small town north of Trois Ponts, a temporary bridge was the last remaining crossing point that could save Piper's advance. A single engineer sergeant from the 291st, under heavy machine gun fire, ran to the centre of the bridge, retrieved the detonator that had been placed there hours earlier, and destroyed the bridge while German troops watched helplessly from the other side. That sergeant's name has been lost to history, but his action trapped Kampfgruppe Piper completely. No bridges forward, no bridges back, supply lines cut, surrounded. The most powerful armoured spearhead in the German offensive had been stopped not by American armour, not by American infantry, but by a few dozen American engineers with demolition charges and extraordinary courage. But stopping Piper was only part of what the 291st accomplished. Malmedy itself became a fortress. Pergrin's engineers, reinforced by elements of other units that trickled in over the following days, established a defensive perimeter around the town. They laid minefields. They constructed roadblocks from felled trees, abandoned vehicles, and rubble. They positioned the few anti-tank guns they had at key approaches, and when German forces probed the defences, the engineers fought them off. On December 21st, German forces launched a major assault on Malmedy. The plan was to capture the town, open the road to Spa and the major supply depots there, and relieve Kampfgruppe Piper, now trapped near L'Église. The attack came from multiple directions, supported by armour and artillery. The defenders of Malmedy included the 201st Engineers, some infantry elements, a few tank destroyers, and anti-aircraft units pressed into ground defence roles. The Germans expected to overrun the position within hours. Instead, they ran into a defensive position that had been laid out by engineers who understood how to create killing zones. The minefields channeled German attacks into predetermined fire lanes. The roadblocks forced tanks into predictable approaches where anti-tank guns waited in concealment. The defensive positions had overlapping fields of fire that had been precisely calculated and measured, and the engineers themselves fought with a ferocity that stunned the attackers. Technical Sergeant Edwin Pigg, a squad leader in Company C 291st Engineer Combat Battalion, found himself commanding a roadblock on the southern edge of Malmedy. When German infantry supported by a Mark IV tank attacked his position, Pigg organised his 8 engineers into a defensive line, directed fire with his M1 carbine, and when the tank broke through the roadblock, personally engaged it with a bazooka. He missed with his first shot. The tank's machine gun fire wounded 2 of his men. Pigg reloaded, steadied himself against a wall and fired again. This time the bazooka round penetrated the tank's thinner side armour. The tank brewed up, blocking the roadway and stopping the German advance. Pigg would later be awarded the Silver Star. He was one of dozens of engineers who earned decorations for actions during the defence of Malmedy. The German assault on Malmedy failed. The town held. And with Malmedy still in American hands, the entire northern shoulder of the German offensive remained blocked. Piper's Kampfgruppe, out of fuel and ammunition, surrounded and battered, was forced to abandon its vehicles on December 23rd and escape on foot. Of the 5,000 men who had begun the offensive with such confidence, fewer than 1,000 made it back to German lines. The rest were dead or captured. For its actions during the Battle of the Bulge, the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion was awarded a Presidential Unit Citation, the highest unit award in the American military. The citation read in part, "Though greatly outnumbered and constantly subjected to heavy enemy artillery, mortar and small arms fire, the officers and men of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion stubbornly resisted all enemy attempts to drive through their positions. The determination, devotion to duty, and unyielding fighting spirit displayed by the personnel of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion in delaying and containing a powerful enemy force along a route of vital importance to the Allied effort, are worthy of high praise. But the greatest accomplishment of American combat engineers was yet to come. By February 1945, Allied forces had pushed the Germans back and were approaching the Rhine River, Germany's last natural defensive barrier. The Rhine is no ordinary river. Over 700 miles long, averaging 1,300 feet wide, exceptionally deep and swift-flowing, it had served as Germany's shield against invasion from the west since Roman times. German commanders assumed that even if they lost the territory west of the Rhine, the river itself would halt the Allied advance. They would destroy all the bridges, force the Allies to conduct massive amphibious operations, and buy time to organise a final defence of the German heartland. Every major bridge across the Rhine was prepared for demolition. Explosives were positioned, detonation teams were assigned, orders were clear. As Allied forces approached, the bridges would be destroyed. The Americans would face a river crossing that military planners estimated would require weeks of preparation and would result in tens of thousands of casualties. On March 7, 1945, those assumptions were shattered. Elements of the 9th Armoured Division, advancing toward the Rhine near the town of Remagen, made a discovery that would change the final campaign of the European war. At 1 p.m., Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Engerman's task force broke out of the woods onto the bluffs overlooking Remagen and saw the Ludendorff Railroad Bridge still standing intact across the Rhine. Engerman couldn't believe it. His orders had been to capture the town of Remagen and then turn south along the Rhine's western bank. Capturing a bridge across the Rhine wasn't even considered possible. German doctrine required all Rhine bridges to be destroyed before Allied forces could reach them. But there it was, a railway bridge, over 1,000 feet long, built during World War I, still standing. And more incredibly, German troops and vehicles were still crossing it, retreating eastward. Engerman made an instantaneous decision. Forget the orders, take the bridge. The attack developed with shocking speed. American infantry and tanks raced down the slopes toward Remagen. German defenders, a hodgepodge of convalescents, engineers and anti-aircraft crews, realized what was happening and attempted to detonate the demolition charges on the bridge. At 3:20 p.m., as American troops entered Remagen, there was a massive explosion on the bridge. The structure shook, rose into the air, and seemed to hang there for a moment. Then, incredibly, it settled back onto its foundations. The German engineers had placed the demolition charges incorrectly. The bridge was damaged but still standing. American infantry began crossing immediately, under intense German fire. Sergeant Alexander Drabik, carrying his M1 Garand, was the first American soldier to reach the eastern bank of the Rhine. Behind him came Lieutenant Karl Timmermann's company, fighting their way across while German machine guns raked the bridge and German artillery began to range in. By 4 p.m., Americans were established on the eastern bank of the Rhine. For the first time, Allied forces had crossed Germany's last great defensive barrier. The capture of the Ludendorff Bridge was front-page news around the world. In Germany, Hitler flew into a rage. He ordered the officers responsible for the bridge's defence to be court-martialed and shot. Some were. He demanded that the bridge be destroyed at all costs. The Luftwaffe, which had been virtually absent from the skies for months, was ordered to concentrate everything on destroying the bridge. V-2 rockets, Germany's most advanced weapons, were fired at the bridge from over 100 miles away. German frogmen were sent to place demolition charges on the bridge supports. None of it mattered. Because while Germany was focused on destroying one bridge, American combat engineers were building more. The 291st Engineer Combat Battalion, fresh from its triumph in the Ardennes, was assigned the most challenging mission. They would build a treadway bridge across the Rhine, just downstream from the captured Ludendorff Bridge. The mission came with multiple challenges. The Rhine at Remagen was over 1,000 feet wide and flowing at nearly 10 feet per second. The current was so strong that it could sweep away bridge sections if they weren't properly anchored. German artillery had the entire area ranged. The Luftwaffe was attacking multiple times per day, and the bridge would have to support the traffic of an entire army. Tanks, trucks, artillery, supplies. Everything needed to pour American forces into Germany. The 291st began construction at 8:30 a.m. on March 9, 1945. They were assisted by a platoon from the 290th Engineer Combat Battalion and the 988th and 998th Treadway Bridge Companies. The Treadway Bridge was a marvel of American engineering. Developed early in the war, it consisted of aluminum alloy panels that could be assembled into floating bridge sections. Each section was 25 feet long and could support 30 tons. The sections were connected together and anchored against the current. The result was a tactical bridge that could be assembled rapidly and adjusted to varying water conditions. But assembling it under fire was another matter entirely. From the moment construction began, German artillery opened up. The Germans had forward observers on the heights east of the Rhine who could see the construction site clearly. They called in fire from multiple artillery battalions. Shells began falling around the engineers within minutes of construction starting. Private First Class Harold Hollinshead of the 291st was positioning a bridge section when an artillery shell exploded 20 feet away. Shrapnel tore through his left arm and shoulder. Medics rushed forward and dragged him to cover, but before they could evacuate him, Hollinshead broke free and returned to his bridge section. His squad leader ordered him to the rear. Hollinshead refused. With his left arm useless and bleeding, he continued working with his right hand, helping guide the section into position. He would work for another 3 hours before finally collapsing from blood loss. He survived and was awarded the Silver Star. Hollinshead's story was not unusual. All along the construction site, engineers worked through artillery barrages that would have sent infantry scrambling for cover. They understood that every minute counted. Every hour the bridge took to complete was another hour American forces couldn't cross, another hour for German defences to organise. The Luftwaffe added to the chaos. On March 10th, German jets, the revolutionary Me-262s that should have given Germany air superiority, attacked the bridge site. The jets screamed in at over 500 miles per hour, far faster than American fighters could intercept. They dropped bombs and strafed with cannon fire. One bomb exploded in the river near a bridge section, the blast wave threatening to break the structure apart. Engineers diving into the freezing water secured the section with additional cables, working underwater while the current tried to sweep them away. American anti-aircraft guns fired continuously, throwing up a curtain of steel that made German pilots fly higher, reducing their accuracy, but they kept coming. During one attack, a German shell struck a pontoon section, blowing a 50-foot gap in the partially completed bridge. Engineers had to rebuild that section while under continued fire. Technical Sergeant Howard Sippel, a construction foreman from Michigan, organised a repair party. While German shells fell around them and machine gun fire from the eastern bank kicked up waterspouts, Sippel's men worked to replace the destroyed section. It took 2 hours. 3 men were wounded, 1 was killed, but they completed the repair. On the eastern bank, German forces attempted direct fire on the construction site. Panzer units in the town of Erpel, which overlooked the river, positioned their tanks and fired high explosive shells at the engineers. The range was less than a mile. German tank commanders could see individual American soldiers. The engineers couldn't take cover. There was no cover. The river was a 1/4 mile wide and completely open. They could only work faster, hunched against the expected impact, and hope the German gunners missed. American forces responded by bringing forward every available weapon. Tank destroyers positioned on the western heights fired at German positions. Artillery laid down suppressive fire. Fighter bombers screamed in to attack German artillery positions and strong points. The battle for the Rhine became a race. Could the Germans destroy the bridges before enough Americans crossed to make the bridgehead secure? Could American engineers build faster than German forces could destroy? Through it all, the engineers kept working, day and night, under artillery fire, under air attack, in rain, in cold, without sleep. Pergrin directing the construction. From a command post that was itself repeatedly hit by German fire, rotated crews every 4 hours to prevent complete exhaustion. But most engineers worked far longer than their shifts. They understood what was at stake. At 5:10 p.m. on March 10th, 1945, just 32.5 hours after construction began, the Treadway Bridge touched down on the eastern bank of the Rhine. At 132 feet long, it was the longest tactical bridge ever built under fire, and it had been completed in less than 2 days while under constant enemy attack. Vehicles began crossing immediately: tanks, trucks, artillery, self-propelled guns, ambulances, supply vehicles, an endless stream of American military power flowing across the Rhine into Germany. The engineers had created a lifeline. But the story doesn't end there, because the Ludendorff Bridge, the original railroad bridge that had been captured intact, was failing. The initial German demolition attempt had weakened the structure. Constant artillery bombardments had inflicted further damage. The stress of thousands of tons of traffic crossing daily was pushing the bridge beyond its design limits. American engineers worked frantically to shore up the structure. They brought in structural steel, they positioned additional supports, they reinforced weak points. But on March 17, 1945, 10 days after its capture, while 200 engineers were working on the bridge, the inevitable happened. At 3 p.m., with no warning, the Ludendorff Bridge collapsed. The entire centre span dropped into the Rhine, taking with it engineers, vehicles and equipment. The noise was described by witnesses as deafening. 1,000 feet of steel and concrete crashing into the river, creating a wave that swept both upstream and downstream. Rescuers rushed to the scene. Some engineers had been thrown clear and were pulled from the water. Others had been crushed by falling debris. Many were swept away by the current and were never found. The final casualty count from the bridge collapse was sobering. 28 engineers were confirmed dead. 18 were missing, presumably drowned in the Rhine's swift current. 63 were injured, some critically. Most of the casualties were from the 276th Engineer Combat Battalion, which had been working on the main span when it collapsed. The loss was devastating. But even as rescuers were still searching for survivors, American forces continued to cross the Rhine. Because by March 17th, there wasn't just one bridge, there were 4. In addition to the Treadway Bridge built by the 291st, other engineer units had constructed a heavy pontoon bridge and a Bailey Bridge. A 4th bridge was under construction downstream. The engineers had built redundancy into the system. The loss of the Ludendorff Bridge, while tragic, didn't slow the American advance by a single hour. The story of American combat engineers at Remagen became legendary. German prisoners of war, interrogated after their capture, expressed disbelief at what they had witnessed. One German artillery officer captured on March 15th told his interrogators, "We fired every gun we had at those bridges. We hit them again and again. We saw the shells exploding. We saw men falling, but they never stopped. They just kept building. In the German army, if pioneers come under fire, they take cover and wait for infantry to clear the enemy. Your engineers, they kept working while shells were falling on them. This is not normal. This is not how combat engineers are supposed to behave." That statement captured the fundamental misunderstanding that cost Germany the war in the West. German military doctrine separated combat functions from support functions. Pioneers built things. Infantry fought. The two roles didn't overlap. The Americans had created something different. The combat engineer. A soldier who could build a bridge in the morning and defend it as infantry in the afternoon. Who understood that construction was a combat operation and treated it accordingly. Who didn't wait for someone else to provide security because they were perfectly capable of providing their own security. The psychological impact on German forces was profound. Traditional military thinking holds that support troops are vulnerable targets, attack the enemy's supply lines, destroy their bridges, and you cripple their army. But American combat engineers turned that doctrine on its head. Attacking American engineers was dangerous. They were armed. They were trained. They fought back effectively. And if you destroyed their bridge, they'd build another one. German forces that had learned to exploit the vulnerability of support units in other armies found themselves taking casualties when they tried the same tactics against American engineers. A Wehrmacht infantry officer, captured near Remagen on March 20th, described an encounter with American engineers that had gone disastrously wrong. His company had been ordered to raid an engineer bridge construction site, expecting to find support troops who would flee when attacked. Instead, they found combat engineers who returned fire immediately, called in artillery support and counterattacked. The German company lost 40 men before withdrawing. The engineers completed their bridge on schedule. Throughout the war, American combat engineers compiled a record of achievement that was unprecedented in military history. By war's end, they had built thousands of bridges across Europe and the Pacific. They had cleared millions of mines. They had repaired or constructed tens of thousands of miles of roads. They had fought as infantry when needed, often distinguishing themselves in combat. The 291st alone built over 70 bridges during the war, 19 of them under enemy fire. They cleared 7,000 mines. They demolished 6 bridges to stop German advances. They made 7 river assault crossings. They fought in the Battle of the Bulge, earning a Presidential Unit citation. They built the longest tactical bridge ever constructed under fire at Remagen. But perhaps more importantly, they changed how armies thought about combat engineers. Before World War II, engineers were specialists, support troops. They worked behind the lines, building fortifications and infrastructure while combat troops did the fighting. The American experience in World War II proved that model was obsolete. In modern warfare, with its fluid front lines, rapid movements, and integrated combined arms operations, engineers had to be combat soldiers first. The engineering skills were still essential, but they had to be coupled with the ability to fight. This lesson was learned by other armies, sometimes painfully. The British, with their long military traditions, initially kept their engineers separate from combat operations. They had pioneers who built things and infantry who fought. The two rarely mixed. British commanders watching American engineers work at Remagen and elsewhere began to reconsider. Post-war reforms in the British Army gave engineers far more combat training. The German Army never learned the lesson during the war. Their pioneers remained specialists throughout the conflict. When the situation required engineers to fight, they generally performed poorly. They weren't trained for it. They weren't equipped for it. Their doctrine didn't support it. The Soviet Army, through different circumstances, arrived at similar conclusions as the Americans. Soviet combat engineers, forged in the desperate fighting of 1941 and 1942, learned to fight out of necessity. By 1945, Soviet engineer units were formidable combat forces capable of both constructing bridges under fire and leading infantry assaults on fortified positions. The legacy of American World War II combat engineers lives on. Modern Army engineer doctrine directly traces its lineage to the innovations and sacrifices of units like the 291st. The motto of the US Army Corps of Engineers, Essayons, Let Us Try, reflects the spirit of those men who attempted the impossible and succeeded. The threefold mission of modern combat engineers, mobility, counter-mobility and survivability, was defined by World War II experience. Mobility operations ensuring friendly forces can move forward. Counter-mobility operations denying movement to enemy forces. Survivability operations protecting friendly forces from enemy fire and effects. These aren't abstract doctrinal concepts. They're lessons learned from places like Malmedy, where engineers enabled American mobility while denying it to German forces, and Remagen, where engineers created the means for the American army to cross Germany's last great barrier. The men who served in engineer battalions during World War II came home to build the America of the post-war era. The skills they had honed under fire, the ability to solve complex problems under pressure, the leadership they had developed in combat, these served them well in civilian life. Many returned to engineering careers, building the highways, bridges and infrastructure of modern America. Others used the GI Bill to earn degrees and enter professions far removed from engineering. But they all carried with them the knowledge that they had accomplished something extraordinary. They had proven that American ingenuity, properly applied, could overcome any obstacle. They had shown that technical skill combined with combat courage was an unstoppable combination. They had built bridges under fire and fought off panzer assaults. They had earned the respect of friend and foe alike. Colonel David Pergrin, who had led the 291st through the Ardennes and across the Rhine, returned to civilian life and had a successful career in private industry. He rarely spoke about the war. When he did, he focused not on his own leadership but on the courage of his men. The sergeants who had run into fire to detonate demolition charges. The privates who had worked through artillery barrages to complete bridges. The specialists who had fought off German attacks while armed only with rifles and determination. In 1998, Pergrin was awarded the Freedom Foundation's George Washington Medal of Honor. In 2012, he passed away at the age of 94. His obituary noted his engineering degree from Penn State, his successful business career, his family. But the headline focused on what he had accomplished in a few short years during the 1940s. He was the man who had stopped Joachim Peiper, the man who had held Malmedy, the man who had built the bridge at Remagen. In Germany, the story was told differently. Veterans of Kampfgruppe Peiper, the few who survived, spoke of the Battle of the Bulge with a mixture of pride and frustration. They had come so close to breaking through. They had fought brilliantly against superior numbers and firepower. But they had been stopped. Not by American armour, which they felt they could match. Not by American infantry, which they believed they could defeat. They had been stopped by engineers, by men with demolition charges who destroyed every bridge at precisely the right moment. by soldiers who built fortifications that channeled attacks into killing zones, by troops who fought like infantry when the situation demanded it. In post-war interviews, German officers who had participated in the Ardennes offensive consistently cited American engineers as one of the key factors in the offensive's failure. They had planned for many contingencies: American air superiority, reinforcements from American armour, defensive positions manned by fresh American troops. What they hadn't planned for was having their entire route of advance systematically dismantled by a few hundred engineers who refused to retreat and possessed the skill to destroy infrastructure faster than German forces could capture it. At Remagen, the story was even more stark. The capture of the Ludendorff Bridge is often portrayed as a lucky break, a case of German incompetence allowing Americans to seize an intact bridge. That narrative misses the point. Yes, German engineers failed to destroy the bridge properly, but what mattered was what happened next. American engineers immediately reinforced the captured bridge while simultaneously building additional bridges. They worked under fire, they suffered casualties, they refused to stop. Within days, the single lucky bridge had become an unstoppable flood of American military power crossing into Germany. That wasn't luck. That was engineering expertise combined with extraordinary courage under fire. German forces threw everything they had at those bridges: artillery, air attacks, commandos, V-2 rockets, the most advanced weapons Germany possessed. Nothing worked. The bridges stood. The traffic continued. The American army poured across the Rhine, and American engineers kept building. The final word perhaps belongs to an anonymous German soldier, captured near Remagen in late March 1945. During his interrogation, he was asked what had surprised him most about American forces. His answer was recorded by the interrogation officer. "The engineers," he said. "We were told that Americans were soft, that they didn't know how to fight, that they relied on their machines and their factories, not on their soldiers. All of that was wrong, but the engineers, that was the biggest surprise. In our army, pioneers are just workers in uniform. They dig, they build. When the shooting starts, they leave. Your engineers, they don't leave. They stay. They build under fire. They fight when they must. They blow bridges with tanks rolling toward them. They rebuild bridges while artillery is falling on them. This is not normal. This is not how pioneers behave. Your engineers are soldiers first, and that makes them very dangerous. We learned to fear them. When we heard that American engineers were in an area, we knew we would face difficulties. They would destroy every bridge we needed. They would build every bridge you needed. They would fight to hold their positions. Attacking them meant taking casualties. They were never easy targets, never vulnerable. In the end, it wasn't your tanks that beat us. We could fight tanks. It wasn't your infantry. We had fought infantry before. It was your ability to move, to build bridges faster than we could destroy them, to repair roads overnight, to clear obstacles while we watched helplessly. Your engineers gave your army the ability to go anywhere, cross anything, overcome any barrier. That is what defeated us. Not courage, though you had that. Not weapons, though you had those too. It was engineering, the ability to make the impossible possible, to build what shouldn't be built, to move when movement should be impossible. We mocked your engineers at first. We called them workers, support troops, not real soldiers. By the end, we feared them more than your tanks. That statement, found in captured interrogation records now housed at the National Archives, summarizes the transformation that occurred between 1943 and 1945. American combat engineers had gone from being unknown and underestimated to being one of the most feared elements of the American military machine. The numbers support this transformation. During the European campaign, from D-Day to VE Day, American engineer units built over 2,900 bridges. They cleared 2.5 million mines. They repaired or constructed over 60,000 miles of roads. They made 127 river assault crossings under fire. They supported every major operation, from Normandy to the Rhine to the final drive into Germany. The cost was significant. Engineer units suffered casualty rates comparable to infantry. The 291st Engineer Combat Battalion lost 23 men killed in action and 187 wounded. Company C alone had a 40% casualty rate. These weren't casualties suffered in construction accidents or behind the lines. They were combat casualties, suffered while building bridges under artillery fire fighting off panzer attacks, clearing mines under direct observation, and conducting demolitions with enemy forces approaching. Each bridge built under fire was a tactical victory. Each bridge demolished to stop enemy advances was a strategic success. Each defensive position held against overwhelming odds was a testament to training, courage, and determination. The Pacific Theatre told a similar story with different details. In the island-hopping campaign across the Pacific, engineer units faced challenges that made Europe look straightforward. They built bridges through jungles. They constructed airfields on coral atolls. They cleared caves defended by Japanese troops who fought to the death. They operated in heat, humidity, and terrain that would have stopped most military operations cold. The 1st Marine Division's Engineer Battalion, fighting through Guadalcanal, Cape Gloucester, Peleliu, and Okinawa, earned the nickname the Pioneers of Hell for their ability to build roads through terrain that shouldn't support roads, clear defences that seemed impregnable, and fight as infantry when the Japanese inevitably counterattacked. On Peleliu, Marine engineers used flamethrowers and demolition charges to clear the cave systems that honeycombed the island's ridges. This wasn't engineering in any traditional sense. It was combat, pure and simple, but it required engineering knowledge to understand how to collapse caves, how to use shaped charges to penetrate rock, how to calculate demolition requirements for underground fortifications. The Japanese, like the Germans, had no comparable units. Japanese engineers built fortifications and infrastructure but weren't trained or equipped for sustained combat. When American forces needed to clear Japanese fortifications, engineer units did it because infantry lacked the specialized knowledge of demolitions and structural engineering required. In the Philippines, Army engineer units rebuilt the entire infrastructure of the islands while still under fire from Japanese holdouts. They repaired bridges the Japanese had destroyed during their retreat. They cleared harbours of sunken ships and mines. They rebuilt airfields faster than Japanese attacks could damage them. They did all of this while Japanese snipers took shots at them from the jungle, and while occasional Japanese counterattacks required them to drop their tools and pick up weapons. The Seabees, the Navy's construction battalions, performed similar miracles throughout the Pacific. Though technically Navy personnel, they operated on the same principle as Army combat engineers. They were builders who could fight and fighters who could build. Their motto, "We build, we fight," captured the dual nature of their mission perfectly. At Guadalcanal, Seabees completed Henderson Field while under bombardment from Japanese artillery and aircraft. The airfield, once operational, allowed American aircraft to provide air cover for the entire Guadalcanal campaign. Building that airfield, under fire, in jungle conditions with limited equipment, ranks as one of the engineering achievements of the war. On Okinawa, the 77th Infantry Division's Engineer Battalion faced a challenge that seemed impossible. They needed to build a supply road up the face of the Maida Escarpment, a 500-foot cliff that Japanese forces had turned into a fortress. Under constant fire, engineers blasted a road from the cliff face, using demolitions to create switchbacks and using bulldozers to grade a path that vehicles could traverse. It took 3 weeks. Japanese defenders fired down on them constantly. Engineers worked in shifts, replacing casualties, continuing regardless of losses. When the road was completed, supplies flowed to the top of the escarpment, enabling American forces to take the position. That road shouldn't have been possible. The terrain didn't support it. The enemy fire should have stopped it. But engineers built it anyway, because the mission required it, and because American doctrine held that engineers didn't stop because a job was difficult or dangerous. Back in Europe, as the war entered its final weeks, engineer units faced their last great challenge, crossing the Elbe River, the final barrier before Berlin. The mission fell to multiple engineer units, including elements of the 291st, which had come so far since those desperate days in the Ardennes. The Elbe crossing, conducted in April 1945, was almost anticlimactic compared to the Rhine. German resistance was crumbling, Luftwaffe attacks were rare, artillery fire was sporadic. The bridges went up quickly, efficiently, with minimal casualties. It was a demonstration of how much American engineers had learned, how efficient they had become, and how completely they had mastered their craft. But even in these final days, there were reminders of the cost. On April 11, 1945, a small detachment of engineers from the 291st was clearing a roadblock near Weimar when they came across something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Following a railroad spur, they found Buchenwald concentration camp. The engineers weren't liberators in any planned sense. They had simply followed a road and found hell. What they witnessed, the skeletal prisoners, the mountains of corpses, the industrial machinery of death, affected them profoundly. These were men who had seen the worst of combat, who had seen friends killed, who had witnessed the aftermath of the Malmedy massacre. But nothing had prepared them for Buchenwald. Lieutenant Harold Walton, leading the engineer detachment, immediately reported what they had found. Photographers and officers arrived. The camp was secured. Medical personnel began treating survivors. The engineers, their mission suddenly feeling far more significant, understood why they had fought. This was what they had been fighting against. This was what the bridges had been built to stop. This was why men had died building Bailey bridges under artillery fire, and why engineers had stood their ground at Malmedy against overwhelming odds. The war in Europe ended 3 weeks later. VE Day, May 8th, 1945. In Germany, American engineers were already at work, repairing the infrastructure their army had destroyed. The same men who had blown bridges to stop German advances now rebuilt them to allow reconstruction. The same units that had laid mines now cleared them. The transition from destruction to reconstruction happened almost overnight. It was what engineers did. They solved problems. During the war, the problem was how to move armies forward and stop enemy forces. After the war, the problem was how to rebuild a shattered continent. The skills transferred seamlessly. Colonel Pergrin, reflecting years later on the war, made an observation that captured the essence of the combat engineer experience. "We weren't heroes," he said. "We were just engineers trying to do our jobs. The circumstances happened to be a bit more difficult than peacetime construction. There was some shooting, occasional artillery fire. The deadlines were strict and the consequences of failure were significant. But the work itself, the engineering, that was straightforward. Calculate the loads, assess the materials, design the structure, build it. The fact that we did this while people were actively trying to kill us, that was just another variable in the equation, one more factor to account for in the planning." That matter-of-fact attitude, that refusal to see their accomplishments as extraordinary, was characteristic of combat engineers throughout the war. They had been given impossible missions and had completed them. They had been told to build bridges under fire, and they had built bridges under fire. They had been ordered to hold positions until relieved, and they had held positions until relieved. They had been tasked with stopping panzer assaults with only rifles and bazookas, and they had stopped panzer assaults. It wasn't heroism to them. It was just the job. But to the German officers, who had mocked them at the beginning of the war, to the Wehrmacht commanders who had watched their carefully planned offensives founder on demolished bridges, to the panzer crews who had been stopped cold by obstacles that appeared overnight, American combat engineers were something far beyond ordinary soldiers. They were the embodiment of American industrial and organizational superiority. They represented a military that didn't separate support from combat, but integrated them seamlessly. They proved that properly trained and equipped soldiers could perform multiple roles without sacrificing effectiveness in any of them. Today, the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion's colours are preserved, bearing campaign streamers from Normandy, northern France, Rhineland, Ardennes, Alsace, and Central Europe. The Presidential Unit Citation streamer is there too, a permanent reminder of those desperate days in December 1944 when a few hundred engineers held the line against the might of the Waffen-SS. The bridge at Remagen is gone, destroyed in 1945. But on the western bank of the Rhine, there's a museum dedicated to the bridge and its capture. Inside, among the artifacts and photographs, is a display about the engineers who built the replacement bridges. There are photos of men working under fire, combat reports describing casualties suffered during construction, letters home from engineers describing the work, and there's a quote from a German artillery officer captured in March 1945 that serves as the exhibit's conclusion. "We fired 1,000 shells at that bridge. We hit it many times. We killed some of the engineers building it. But they never stopped. They just kept building. In the morning we would damage the bridge, and by evening it was repaired. We would destroy a section, and the next day a new section was in place. It was like fighting the ocean. No matter how many waves you stopped, more waves kept coming. That's when I knew we had lost. Not because of any single battle or any single defeat, but because we were fighting an enemy that could build faster than we could destroy. An enemy whose engineers were also soldiers. An enemy that had solved the fundamental problem of modern war, how to keep armies moving regardless of obstacles, Your engineers beat us. Not your generals, not your tanks, not your aircraft. Your engineers with their bridges and their bulldozers and their refusal to quit. They built the roads your armies used to invade Germany. They cleared the obstacles we placed in your path. They created the means for your victory. And when we tried to stop them, they fought us and won. I underestimated them. We all did. That was our mistake, and it cost us the war. That quote, more than any military analysis or historical assessment, captures the truth of what American combat engineers accomplished during World War II. They had been mocked, underestimated, and dismissed. German officers who came from a military tradition stretching back centuries couldn't conceive that support troops could also be combat troops, that engineers could build bridges while under fire and then defend those bridges against armoured assault, that men with slide rules and surveying equipment could also be effective infantry. The American military had created something new, not through any grand strategic insight, but through practical necessity and American pragmatism. Engineers needed to be at the front, so they needed to know how to fight. Construction would happen under fire, so engineers needed to be comfortable under fire. Support functions and combat functions would overlap, so personnel needed to be trained for both. This wasn't revolutionary military theory. It was simple, practical problem solving. But the results were revolutionary. German forces found themselves facing an opponent who could overcome obstacles faster than those obstacles could be created, who could repair destruction faster than it could be inflicted, who treated bridges and roads not as fixed infrastructure, but as temporary assets that could be created, destroyed, or modified as the tactical situation required. The psychological impact was devastating. German military doctrine was built on fixed assumptions about how wars were fought. Armies moved on roads and across bridges. Control the infrastructure, and you control the movement of armies. Destroy bridges, and you stop advances. This doctrine had worked for centuries. Against the Americans, it failed completely, because American engineers could build a bridge in hours, not days, could repair a road overnight, could create crossings where none should exist. The infrastructure wasn't fixed. It was fluid, dynamic, constantly changing, and German forces had no doctrine, no training, and no experience dealing with an enemy whose engineers could alter the battlefield's fundamental geography faster than German forces could exploit it. In the final accounting, American combat engineers proved that in modern warfare, mobility is decisive. The army that can move faster, cross obstacles more quickly, and maintain logistics over any terrain will win. Firepower matters, training matters, equipment matters. But mobility, the ability to be where you need to be when you need to be there, trumps everything else. American combat engineers gave the American military unmatched mobility. They built the means for armies to cross rivers, traverse mountains, advance through forests, and overcome every natural and man-made obstacle. They did this under fire without complaint, with casual competence that bordered on arrogance, and in doing so they changed warfare forever. Every modern military now trains combat engineers who can both build and fight. The American model, proven in the forests of the Ardennes and on the banks of the Rhine, is now universal military doctrine. Engineers are combat troops who happen to have specialized technical skills. They're expected to work under fire. They're trained to fight when necessary. They're integrated into combat operations from planning through execution. This seems obvious now. In 1943, it was revolutionary. German officers who mocked the American combat engineers at the beginning of the war learned a lesson that military forces worldwide have internalized. Never underestimate the engineers. They build the bridges your armies cross. They clear the mines that would stop your advance. They create the infrastructure that enables victory. And if you attack them, they'll fight back with the same determination they bring to construction. Mock them at your peril. Because those damned engineers, as Joachim Peiper called them in December 1944, will stop your panzers with demolition charges, will hold impossible positions against overwhelming odds, and will build bridges under fire that allow armies to cross rivers that should be uncrossable. They'll do the impossible, not because they're heroes, though many are, but because the job requires it, and because someone has to do it, and because American military doctrine says engineers are combat soldiers first. German officers mocked American combat engineers in 1943. By 1945, there were no German officers left to mock anyone. The Third Reich was rubble, its armies destroyed, its infrastructure demolished, and across every river, spanning every obstacle, enabling the advance that brought final victory, were bridges built by American combat engineers, built under fire, built despite casualties, built because the mission required it. The thunder of artillery, the scream of incoming shells, the crack of rifle fire, the roar of explosions. Through it all, the steady sound of hammers on steel, of equipment moving, of soldiers working, engineers building bridges, soldiers securing positions, Americans advancing, unstoppable, because nothing could stop the men who built the roads and bridges that armies travelled. Those damned engineers, the men who won the war one bridge at a time.